Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the In Our Humble Opinion podcast. My name is Jacob, and as always, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our show. This week, we have perhaps the most thought-provoking episode we have ever recorded. We are going to be talking about the infamous debate between determinism, free will, and predestination, so you won't want to miss it. Before we jump into the show, however, we humbly ask for you to consider subscribing if you're enjoying the content, either on YouTube or wherever you get your audio entertainment. And with that said, without any further ado, we hope you enjoy the show. Thank you so much.
The Bible so puts it that our hearts are so far astray in our sin that we are incapable of choosing God. If that sounds strange to some hearers, many of my hearers are going to be aware of the Calvinist Arminian debate on this issue, and they may be surprised to hear that both Jacob Arminius and John Calvin both believed that the human will was utterly incapable of choosing for Christ. We were so lost in sin that unless God provides grace to us prior to our decision, we cannot be saved.
So what does that mean for free will? It means in some sense we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There's always the wild card. There's always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do.
But I am what philosophers call a compatibilist when it comes to free will, which is I don't think that I have some ways of thinking my way into overcoming the laws of physics, right? Like I'm made of atoms, made of particles that obey the laws of physics. If I talk about myself as a large collection of atoms and particles obeying the laws of physics, then clearly there's no free will. There's just the solution to the equation.
Predestination, as I understand it, is God's determination to elect His own. According to Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, that God chose us before the foundation of the world. And so that should provide us this assurance that when I am saved because God has had mercy on me, not because I've been so wise that I've chosen for God.
All right, Brantley, so we have a mammoth of a topic today. This is going to definitely be one of our more thought-provoking episodes. I'm quite certain of that. As we mentioned in the introductory piece, we're going to be discussing determinism versus free will, what it means, what it is, or what is it, and basically how that relates to us on this magical journey we call life, because there are some very interesting thoughts in both camps. And as you know, I'm sure longtime listeners would be aware that Brantley and I are religious. We come from religious backgrounds. We actively practice our faith, or at least we attempt to. And so we have that to add to the pool of our perspective. But this is a very complicated subject, and I will be totally transparent in the fact that, Brantley, I do not have a definitive answer one way or the other. I have looked at a lot of material when researching for this episode, and the more I went down the rabbit hole, the more questions that I ended up having. So, I guess we can just jump into it here and get your thoughts on this as well. I know you've been studying things in church that relate to this topic, so why don't you expand on that for me and our audience, and we'll just jump into it.
Yes, the age-old question, at least the religious aspect of the church. It's interesting, Jacob. You mentioned free will the other day, which is how we got to this as a topic. And at church, my fiance and I we've been hearing constantly predestination. So the leaders of our church do, as far as I know, believe in predestination, which in this case would be, I would say, determinism, as you called it. Mm-hmm. External forces that ultimately cause the direction of your life without necessarily your choice. In the history of the church, there's actually two sects of this. The first section would be Arminianism, not from Armenia, but Arminianism, which is the idea that um, humans find God and then God saves them, and then they're believers in Christ. The other falls under the what's it called? Calvinistic approach, which most Presbyterian churches. This is a Presbyterian church, by the way. Follow Calvinism, which is the idea that predestination, people are predetermined before you're even born to be saved. So, as a guy laid it out, what does that look like? For the Arminianism, that is, here's Sally Sue over here. She doesn't know Jesus or God. That's how you get saved in Christianity. She doesn't know Jesus, but um, throughout her life, she starts to improve. She starts to do things right, and she chooses herself to believe in Jesus. And then God's like, okay, I'll take you in now. And then the other approach is before you're even born, God, which is this predestination, picks you. This person I have predetermined will be saved by me. And they will,
So,
they're predestined to be with my kingdom.
so where do you stand on that? Because it seems to me that if either one of those viewpoints is true, then in a large degree, free will is some sort of illusionary, mindset that we have. And that if in the womb or during conception, it was predetermined whether we will be saved or we won't be saved, that does seem that doesn't quite feel right. And I don't know
No,
I don't know how else to articulate it, but that doesn't quite feel like that's the way it should be or is.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, to go to a group of people and tell them I was predestined to be saved and you will never be saved because you weren't predetermined. It's the same thing as tell them, oh, God chose to make me to go to heaven and then chose to make you to burn in hell.
Right.
Which
Right.
kind of, to me, defeats the purpose of it. He's a loving God. Well, he
Yeah.
just loves all that.
I would agree. I think that
Um,
that undermines a lot of the teachings in the New Testament.
yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of stuff in. When I say a lot of stuff, there's a few verses that they point to for confirmation of predestination. I mean, one of the most famous is Romans 8:28-30, which says, God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son. And those who he predestined are also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. But to me, that doesn't necessarily mean predestination. There's other verses like, you do not believe me because you're not part of my sheep. They point to that as you're not part of the sheep because you weren't predestined to be a part of a sheep. Which you can. That's not really. I don't believe that. That's, to me, that's stupid because how do people become part of a sheep? I think there's a lot that involves becoming a part of Christ's sheep, but the idea that this group of people is predestined and you're not, to me, sounds like elitism. And it paints the church also in a bad light in my book. You're going out to the world and saying these people are predestined and saved, but these other people aren't. So even though we're going to talk to you nonstop, you're still going to burn in hell. But we're still going to talk to you about Christ. Well, then what's the purpose? Which leads me to some other things. We actually asked, what's the point of evangelizing if there's no hope for people regardless? And the response was, well, inside of all of us that are predestined, God we are all dead inside, which I agree. Before Christ, we are spiritually dead. But there's a light switch he puts in those that are predestined that he flips on through evangelism and other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of leads to the point: if the light switch never gets flipped on, are those predestined people still doomed, or are they still going to heaven? So
I guess in that situation, they would still be
saved.
unsaved in that respect, right?
I mean, I guess, but what about the people that don't have that light switch? They're doomed no matter what. It's just unfair to me.
Yeah, I
And
would agree. I would reject that. I don't believe that.
the argument is, well, remember, we're not supposed to have anything. It doesn't matter if we're fair. If we make pottery and we gave 3 of our pots soil and the other ones not soil, we're the creator. We made it. Therefore, we can choose what we want to do with our creation or not. And that leads to the whole mindset that we're just puppets. you know, we're
Yeah.
just being controlled by puppets. There's no free will, none of that, which I think it's hogwash. I mean, I'll say it right here. Um, do I believe I'm saved now? Yeah. A few years ago, would I have believed that? No. Um, there's a lot of people that you could say that about. You say, well, their light switch hasn't flipped on yet. I disagree. You know, we don't find Jesus; He finds us. I think there's a part that works both ways. You know, Christ finds us through evangelization and all that. Then we had to decide: are we going to believe that? Are we going to trust in that? Which it's basically the whole faith thing. Are you going to have faith? Faith? Are you going to have faith and believe and trust in God, or are you not? Well, to me, with predestination, what's the point in having faith? If I'm already predetermined to go to heaven, I don't need to have faith. I don't know. It just puts in a lot of red flags to me.
No, I agree with you. I don't subscribe to either one of those proposals. I think there's too many just philosophical fallacies for me to subscribe to either one of those, if I'm being completely honest with you. Determinism is a little bit different, though, in the sense, well, it's a lot different. It's actually the polar opposite. It's, for those of you who may not know, and I'll just do a very Cliff Notes version of the definition, but it effectively is a more scientific approach to how we characterize behavior. It basically is this philosophical idea that all the actions and behavior that we conduct on a daily basis are determined by a set of physical law. Basically, in layman's term, choice is an illusion, and that everything that we would do is predetermined based on external factors that are outside of our control. Now, a lot of people would hear that and think, that sounds absurd. Of course, we have free will. Of course, we can choose to do one thing versus another. If we stand at the metaphorical fork in the road, we have a choice of going left or right. But there is some interesting schools of thought, if you will, that are
Jake can be cut out.
rooted deep within this philosophical belief. I personally
Can't
don't
hear you.
believe free will is.
Did you hear me, Jake?
Yeah. You good?
Well, I said you cut out, but I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. I cut that part out. But
Sorry.
I personally subscribe to free will existing, or at least I tend to lean more that way, because I do feel like, I think this is something that a lot of academic, people who are in academia, this is what they would suggest, is that a lot of people conduct their life as if free will exists, but their ultimate conclusion is that it doesn't. I don't necessarily agree with that. And based on everything I saw in the scriptures that pertain to free will, there's, and you may know different, Brant, you may be able to correct me on this. There's no definitive verse that explicitly talks about free will in this sort of abstract sense. It's all implied text that would suggest that and it's typically talking about free will in a like in a bondage situation. Every single verse I read was like, you have the choice to do good or evil, or you have the choice to be tempted to do evil, or I should rephrase, when you're tempted to do evil, you have the choice to do it or to not do it. It's sort of like, it
Hmm.
implies that there is some free will to that. But I don't know if, because the behaviorist would say, the determinist would say that based on your background, based on your upbringing, you would be more likely to do, let's say, if you grew up in poverty, you would be more likely to commit theft in order to maintain your lifestyle or to preserve your lifestyle. Whereas people who grew up in the middle to upper class would have no need to do such things. And so, based on that external factor, probability would suggest they're more determined, or they've been determined to do those things. It gets very, obviously this is a very abstract conversation, and this is very much a mental exercise just to even keep up with what we're trying to discuss. But I don't know. I just feel like throughout my research, there was points that either side made that made sense. And I don't think you can entirely discount it. Those who would oppose determinism, there's not a scientific way to quantify free will. But at the same time, determinism doesn't answer everything either. And it's very much the atheistic viewpoint, which is something that I think all religious people, when they hear that, are just like, no, that can't possibly, be, we have to shut it off and not even listen to it, which I don't think that's the healthiest thing in the world for discussion or, for personal growth. So I try to listen to both sets of conversations and both arguments and then determine my own conclusions. But again, it's just, I don't know. I hate to get to the end of these discussions and then throw my shoulders up and say, I'm not really sure. But I find that with this topic in particular, I get perplexed by the end of it, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of it.
Yeah, I mean, determinism is very interesting. Basically, your circumstances are going to dictate your life, is what
Right.
I'm getting out of it. And to that, I say, you see it happen a lot. Like the poor person going to grow up being a criminal. Unfortunately, I mean, statistically speaking. But there's also something I would add that I would throw in there, a wrench into it, as they say, for free will is mindset plays a big role in whether or not you remain poor. I mean, your
Sure.
mindset is a huge factor in life. If you have a mindset every day that you're going to uh, you're always say a victim, or there's no hope for you, or yada yada, I can't do this, then yeah, you're telling yourself, you're believing it yourself, so you're not going to act on it. And that's I think circumstances help mold that mindset, but every mindset can be changed if you push through it. Now, depending on circumstances, is it harder to get through a difficult mindset? Yeah, I mean, if I'm poor, I grow up in a bad neighborhood and all that, my mindset's going to be molded based on those circumstances. But
Right. Right. But
uh,
in my opinion, that's just more of probable outcomes. That's not necessarily deterministic.
well, I mean, if you don't change that mindset, then the determinism fits perfectly. Oh, see, it happened. They did this. But
Yeah, but
if you
that's
look
also
at it,
getting into self-fulfilling prophecies and things like that, where people are continuously falling into the same trap because they believe they're going to in the first place.
well, then if and that what determinism is, though, statistics say this is gonna happen to them because they grew up here, and if they grew up there and their mindset isn't changed, then they fell into that trap.
Well, sure, but how do you explain the outliers? How do you explain those who, get
Who
out of
made it?
poverty? Yeah,
They
effectively.
changed their mindset. They took their free will they had instead of looking at those statistics, letting their circumstances dictate what their life's going to be. They said, I want better. I'm going to change. I'm going to do what I can to get out of here. And we see that. I mean, there's that movie, Pursuit of Happiness. That right there. I mean, the determinism tells me that, hey, this person's not going to, they're going to be another statistic. And what happened? Then they come like a millionaire or something.
Well, yeah, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've seen the film, but he does eventually achieve a job of pretty nice status and what have you. Yeah. So,
And why is that? He's changed his mind.
Yeah, that would, but see, even if one case, at least in my mind, and again, Brantley and I aren't sitting here thinking we're the world authority on this. We absolutely will probably get some things wrong in terms of philosophical presentation and what the actual argument is or the belief is. But in my own opinion, as the show is called, and at least in my mind, whenever I think about this, if there's even one case that would statistically vary from those who would have a deterministic mindset, wouldn't that be a good counter argument that would imply that there is no absolute determinism and that there is these variations and these variables that would suggest that there is some sort of free will or choice involved in one's life?
Most definitely, because you have those cases. Pursuit of Happiness being one of them.
Right.
There's other examples out there I can't think of right off the top. Any rags to riches story, those to me are outliers that prove determinism wrong. And when did let me ask you, when did determinism become a major theory per se? Do we know that?
It's been around for a long time. So I think it was early 20th century is whenever they were really starting to experiment and come up with the doctrine. And now I think it's just been, but the interesting thing about it is if you listen to anybody, whether they be a creationist, an atheist, whatever the case is, there is not a good answer. They will fully admit in all the interviews and all the different clips that I've seen, they will fully admit that there's no rational scientific experiment or scientific explanation for either one. It's just, we don't really know. And there are some who would suggest that determinism is more likely, but free will is. But again, these are, in some cases, in most cases, these are highly academic, highly educated academic professors and doctors who are not religious in any way, shape, or form. So they're trying to find, explanations that satisfy their rational thought, or at least their, what they perceive as rational thought. So, you can take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. But what's interesting for you and me, and for some of the listeners who may have tuned in this week, in terms of, if they subscribe to any form of religion, especially if it's the Christian faith, we're raised in church where we are taught that God is this omnipotent and all-knowing deity, right? That he knows what you're going to do before you do it. At least that's what I remember being taught. And I'm sure there's biblical scripture to back that claim up, but it's just fascinating to me, if that is true, how does that fit into free will? If I have already, at least in this universe where it's already been decided on what I'm going to do, or if God already knows what I'm going to do, then where does my choice come into it? At what point have I made the conscious decision to do that? Is that predetermined at birth? Is that predetermined now in my current set of circumstances? Or but that has to be true, because then I don't know. I'm confusing myself. But this is where I get hung up on, though. These are things that I personally struggle with to rationalize. Where does that part of it end, and where does my free will or my choice actually come into that situation? I don't know.
Here's how I see that the omnipotent, and keep in mind, this will not satisfy uh, anybody really. I mean, this is how I see it. God has laid out. There's multiple paths that we can choose from, uh, and God knows, regardless of which path we choose. If we choose one path, He knows the end result of it. But we have the choice of which path we're choosing, if that makes sense. So basically, we're born, and then here comes our life and all these choices. And God knows whatever choice we make, He knows the end result of that choice. But I don't think we're narrowed down to, oh, this is your path. I already knew you're going to take this, yada, yada, yada.
So
Does that
you would
make sense?
suggest that we get to the fork in the road, and at this point, it hasn't been determined which one we've taken, but the outcome
He would
is.
know. Yeah.
Okay.
So we get to the fork of the road, and there could be thousands, billions, or 5 forks in the road, and the outcome, the choice we make hasn't been determined. But once we make that choice, we already know what's going to happen, or God already knows what the end result will be from that choice. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Now, granted, that doesn't satisfy probably anybody. They're like, well, that doesn't help me at all. That's just how I see it. I don't know. And I still argue against determinism with, the outliers that do happen. I think determinism in the early 20th century, history before then, it makes sense for the poor because the poor pretty much are locked into one road in life in terms of where they'll eventually end up. I mean, if you're born poor in the ancient world, you're going to more than likely stay poor. Why? Because society and the elite of the time made it that way. But nowadays, we see that's not the case at all because if you're born poor, you can end up a millionaire or a billionaire. Not all the time, and it's a small number, but it still happens. And I think that's because now we have, actual freedom from oppressors, at least in America, and we are free thought, and our free will,
Mm-hmm.
is in place now. Like our free will is not hindered by someone that's keeping us down, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought for sure. I would be curious as to what our listeners have to say about this because I do think it is very abstract in the sense that there's not, at least in my estimation, any one ironclad answer to this.
Mm-hmm.
And as it relates to determinism, there is some sort of let's just say it's a sub thought of, I wouldn't necessarily know if it would categorize under determinism, but there's this idea of catch 22, if you've ever heard that expression,
Mm-hmm.
where you're forced with a decision and there is this illusion of choice in that. For example, there is a book actually by Joseph Heller, I believe, Catch 22, where he talks about this idea, illustrating it through a narrative in World War II, if I'm not mistaken. And effectively, this whole idea of a catch 22 is this decision that really isn't a decision, in that, if I could illustrate it, what's a good example? Basically, let's just say, and I'm giving a very basic generalization of this idea, but let's say you were stranded on a raft in the middle of the ocean and you were getting sunburnt. And in order to relieve yourself from the heat, you had to jump into shark-infested waters. Well, obviously, if you jump into shark-infested waters, you would likely get eaten. You would likely die.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not really a decision. In your mind, you can think it is, but it's really not. You don't have that option unless you want to die. So that would be a rough example of a catch-22. Yeah, you technically could do something, but if you do it, you're either going to suffer some physical harm or it's not really a decision because the outcome is so bad. and it sort of illustrates this illusion of choice. In my mind, that's probably the biggest, and I don't even know if that, again, if this would fall under determinism, but to me, this is definitely something that I feel like has some merit in terms of the philosophical implications, because I think everybody at some point in their life is faced with numerous catch-22 situations, and you really don't have much choice, do you, when you really consider the options?
I would argue, though, that there's still a possibility that you don't get eaten by a shark. And in that
Sure.
case, where's the catch 22? If determinism says, oh, well, you jump into that water, or catch 22 says you jump into that water, you're more than likely, it's not 100% confirmed. There's still a chance that you don't get eaten. And then in that case, well, oh, was that determined as well? Oh, it was determined you weren't going to get eaten. But statistically saying I was going to. So where's the determinism? I'm an outlier now, which my free choice to jump in, I still survived.
Yeah.
My thinking is I'm going to jump in to survive regardless of what's in there. Does that matter?
No, for sure. And again, my illustration wasn't on point. But and as we said before, I'm not even sure that would fall under determinism. I do think it's some sort of interesting sub thought or school of thought that would sort of hint at this idea that at times, and maybe that's the answer to this, Brant. Maybe that's the final piece of this equation. Determinism and free will both basically say that one can exist, or if one exists, the other doesn't, right? Like that's sort of this whole scientific debate, this whole theological debate, is that one can exist and the other, or if one exists, the other cannot.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's true either, because maybe there are times in our life where we don't have any choice. We do have to continue. And others would say, no, you always have a choice. But I always think of it in terms of like, well, what if I didn't want to go to work?
Yeah.
Well, okay, you don't have to go to work. You'd likely lose your job. You'd likely lose everything you possess. You wouldn't be able to pay for anything. You'd lose your income. And obviously, as I just mentioned, all the fallout consequences for that. Like, yeah, sure, I could go off the grid and live off the grid. But is that something that I want? Is that something I desire? No. So I have to continue to work. I have to continue to bring in the income that I do. And in my opinion, that's kind of a catch-22, because the illusion is that I could not, but the consequences are so severe that it makes no sense for me not to.
Well, I would argue, though, are those consequences actually consequences? Is
Right.
losing internet a consequence?
Well, sure, maybe not internet, but like, shelter, very basic biological need, water, food.
If
You could argue that I could hunt and gather and things of that nature, go back to a more primitive point, but
it'd be difficult for sure, but it's still an option.
suppose
See,
it is. I
the
suppose
the
it is.
problem I see is that, and I understand what you're saying. If we quit our job right now and then go in, yes, we're more likely going to get fired. I don't think that's determinism. That's just, you have a job, you don't show up, you're not doing the work. Why are they paying you? But there's still that option of, well, I can quit the job and possibly struggle for a while as I try to live more primitive, but there's still the option there. And maybe you don't make it living primitive. Maybe you fail. That's you chose that though. There wasn't. Oh, it wasn't determined that you chose that. Was it determined already
Yeah.
that you chose to quit your job?
Yeah. I mean, again, this whole topic, as much as I love talking about it, I must fully admit that I can't speak very intelligently about it.
It
And
is
that
difficult to think on.
a lot of these abstract, different ideas and philosophical beliefs go right over my head. And I try my best not to pretend like I understand something that I don't. I don't want to come across as,
Oh, I agree.
trying to. I fully admit that I don't have hardly any answers when it comes to this topic, but Brantley and I thought it would be an interesting discussion, and I think so far it has been. But as it relates to the let's say the academic minds that really champion these theories, especially when it comes to determinism, they always illustrate it like the universe that we live in has a very finite and physical set of laws, and our existence lies within those physical boundaries. And even though we live and conduct our lives as though we have all this choice, the reality is most of the things that we do have already been set by those physical limitations and laws. And when you hear it explained like that, you think to yourself, okay, well, that makes sense in some respects. There are some, I can't be a professional basketball player because I was born 5'5", whereas that gentleman over there was born 6'6". Like maybe I could, but maybe it was determined that he would have the genetic advantage over me, and I simply just wasn't born with the capability to do that. And maybe
Yeah.
that was determined, or maybe that's a very
Well,
loose way to think about it. But again,
but
I don't
that's
know. Maybe you could be.
statistical. Yeah, I mean that's the if you're really really good, you could still play in the league. I mean, look at Spud Webb. The dude was how tall was Spud Webb? He was really really short for a basketball player,
Yeah, yeah.
but he was good. So he defied those odds. He was 5'6", Jacob. So
Well,
not
yeah, there you go.
2 inches smaller than me, and he was dunking. So I
Isaiah
mean,
Thomas comes to mind as well.
Isaiah Thomas.
But again, as we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, if there is one outlier, does that shatter the foundation of determinism? A lot of people would probably have a very sophisticated answer and say that no, it doesn't, for all these different reasons that I personally just go over in my head. But it seems to me that that is the case. It just seems to me that,
I would say it is.
yeah, I would think so. But I guess my whole hang up on all of this is where, and I like your theory, by the way, before I go into this little spiel. I like your theory about how, who we would say God is looks at free will. Like, I'm going to give you option door number 1, door number 2. I already know what's behind each one, but it's up to you to decide.
Mhm.
I like that theory. That makes sense to me. But there may be some who would come back and argue against it. But
Yeah.
I guess my point is, where in life, in everyday situations, do we have free will? Like, and I'm not even talking about like highly sophisticated situations. I'm talking about, where do I go on my lunch break, or what groceries do I buy? Like, is all of that, would it determine someone who believes in determinism? Would they come back and say, well, if that's predetermined because of this, this, and this, and this? Like, but is it though?
But
I don't know.
and
I don't know.
I'm with you. I'm by no means an expert on this, but a lot of it sounds silly when it comes to determinism
In some
because
respects, yeah.
you're using statistical things, and statistics are great. They are. They work. But there's outliers for all those, and those outliers, to me, prove determinism wrong. Let's say I do quit my job tomorrow, and I win the lottery. Based on determinism, I'm gonna be poor and uh, struggle, whatnot. But guess what? I just won the lottery. That's an outlier. Well, that's an outlier. So there's a nick in your theory, and there's a tons of small nicks into this theory out there. Just we say, well, that's one small thing, but I'm sure there's millions of outliers out there. Does that mean determinism is still the case? Well, what happened to determinism there? What is their life not deterministic, or or what? Because you don't have the statistics to back up what happened with them, what you do with the other person that statistically said this was going to happen.
I agree. I mean, I tend to agree with that. It's interesting. It's a compelling thought. But just to give the audience and even yourself, Brent, some of the ideas of some of the, let's just say, academic side of this argument. And again, this is a largely atheistic viewpoint. Not too many creationists in academia. But this is what Stephen Hawking had to say on the subject matter. He said, he believes in scientific determinism, and he basically expanded that said this is the idea that everything in the universe, including human beings, is entirely physical. Human behavior and decisions are governed by the mechanical forces of physics and chemistry. In other words, human beings have no free will, which again is basically just suggesting that we live in just a physical, which we do. We live in a physical universe that is governed by laws of chemistry, physics, etc., and that everything that we've thought, everything that we think about doing, every decision we've made is set on a predetermined set of variables and factors that, at times we might have the illusion that we're controlling some of these things, but the reality is we're not, and that every decision we've made is based on these external factors that we can possibly never quantify. So
Well,
that's the other side of the aisle to those who would oppose free will. I personally think that free will exists. I personally think that I have choice in my life, and I personally think that there are maybe some points and some moments in my life that are pretty much predetermined because of those catch-22 situations that we talked about. But even in those moments, as we discussed, in some cases, choice is still there. It might be a bad choice, but you can still choose to walk into a buzzsaw if you want to. I wouldn't recommend it, but
deterministically speaking, you're gonna die. But what if you survive? Then
yeah,
what?
what if you just don't?
What
You know
if
how
you
you were
just
on your deathbed? What if you just didn't? What if you just decided not to?
and to the whole there's physical, yeah, in the physical world things are determined. If you jump off a 90 feet building, if you don't die, that's a miracle in itself, which brings another thing, other miracles, but that's another topic for another time.
Mm-hmm.
Physically speaking, yeah, but what about the soul? And I mean, some don't believe, oh, there is no soul, but then others, if you say you're spiritual, then you believe that you have a soul or of something. You're choosing that. Yeah, physically speaking, it might be determined. I mean, physically speaking, if I run in front of a 100-mile-per-hour car, I'm going to die. Is that determined? I would say yes, but there's also the possibility that I live, which kind of shatters determinism in that point. But I can't go out and fly. It's impossible. That's determined. I know that for a fact. I can't fly
Yeah,
without assistance. Yeah, that's determined, but that's physically speaking. Um,
I do find
you
it
know,
kind of humorous to me that Stephen Hawking is famously quoted, and this is from one of his lectures, where he said, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't find the exact quote, but he said basically, after discussing it with many scientists, this idea of determinism, he does find it humorous that they still check both ways before crossing the road,
yeah,
implying that they actually had some choice in the matter, which is quite funny to me. Also, there was another notable atheist whose name eludes me at the moment, who was asked at a lecture about, do you believe free will exists? And he cleverly answered that he has no choice, which is a, obviously double entendre that it wouldn't matter if he said yes or no because there is no free will. So that's that side of the argument. I don't know. Again, I don't know of if it encompasses obviously the creationists, those who are religious and more theological, would come back and say, well, no, actually there is free choice, or free will, I should say, to make the correct choice. And in the Bible, as I mentioned before, there's a number of verses that would suggest that man has the choice to do good or evil, and it is up to them to choose their path, as we've talked about before. So it's a very interesting discussion. I'd love, if you're listening to this and you have some thoughts, please send them our way. We have all of our social media in the show notes and our email. This is one in particular that I would really encourage you to send us some thoughts on, because it's very open for debate, I think, and I'd be curious to hear from all perspectives on this one.
yeah, yeah. What in terms of predestination? What do you think of that? I know it's not exactly lined up with determinism, but
Right.
if it's true, it's still determined what's going to happen to you. Do you think there's billions of people in this world that are just destined to go to hell regardless, and then
No.
there's others that aren't?
No, I can't imagine that, because in the text, and again, I don't know exactly what chapter and verse, but in the scriptures it talks about how every man will have the choice.
Yeah.
Like every man will have the opportunity to become saved.
Yeah.
Because the second
And
coming can't happen until every man has heard.
well, let me throw a wrench into your argument there. And I think it's a weak argument from predestination. The argument there is the people who have that light switch I keep going back to in them that can be flipped on by God to be saved. Those are actually the people that they're going out to evangelize, and they will argue that Jesus says the world to Nicodemus. You remember Nicodemus is the Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Back in their time, the Jews believed that only Jewish people would go to heaven if they believed in God, trusted in God. And Jesus said to Nicodemus, I came, to save the world. In a nutshell, that's what he's saying. And he used the word world, saying Gentiles, obviously. But the predestination argument there is when he's saying world, he's talking about that he's letting the Jewish people, the Nicodemus people, know that there's also Gentiles out there that have that um, light switch that's part of Christ's flock. So he's not talking about everybody in the world. He's just talking about the ones that have that light switch in them. And there's more than just Jewish people with that light switch that can be saved. Again, I wholeheartedly disagree. I think that's a bunch of hogwash. But
Yeah,
that's the
I
argument
can't,
there.
even just from a logical standpoint, I can't subscribe or process that. That doesn't
Well,
make sense to me.
And my fiance and I, we disagree with the church. I'll say this: the church. Why do you go to a church that believes in that that
Forget
doctrine?
your church.
they 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 think that, but they preach gospel. If that's Bible, they preach the Bible, so they fall in line with the Bible. And when it comes to the predestination thing, they don't have a strong argument in that they put their opinion out there. At least the leaders of it, and they even admit this. The guy admitted this, that not everybody in the church believes in predestination, but they all agree that Christ is the Savior, and they say that's the more important thing, not whether or not you believe in predestination. So that's one reason we stay around, because they're preaching actual good stuff, like stuff that lines up biblically, because it's straight from the Bible. Their message is good. There's just one thing we disagree with them there. That if that people are wondering why do you go to predestination church, because stuff like that. And we also got to remember that all these different sects of, I can't say that really well, sections of Christianity, denominations of Christianity, they all have stuff they believe that everybody agrees with. I mean, people have been debating Christianity, inside Christianity, for thousands of years. That's why you have Paul and Peter who didn't agree with each other. I mean, two people who knew Christ, they don't
Right.
agree with each other on certain things.
Yeah, when you get into these religious debates or even these philosophical debates, it's so difficult to
Yeah,
untangle everything because science is constantly at religion's throat trying to basically disprove it, and religion is sitting there trying to answer questions that science in
well,
some
it's
respects
funny.
does a better job at. And then, a lot of people think that the two are mutually exclusive and one can exist without the other. In some respects, or rather in most respects, in
I
my opinion,
agree.
that's entirely not true. And then, you have these really abstract debates where even within the religious community, like us as Christians, would have debates against, say Catholics and Jews and other things about just the
Yeah,
various intricacies of our practices and what we believe, and it gets really messy, and a lot of people take it very personally, and it's a shame because it doesn't have to be that complicated at the end of the day. But
yeah. Either I'll say for the Christian debate, or people who are pro or anti-Christian, either you believe in Christ or you don't. Everything else, um, that's for you to read the Bible and believe. And if you don't believe in Christ and you don't care about being Christian, you choose that. That's fine. That's your choice. That's your choice. And guess what? That was a free choice to make. You made that choice. I'm just saying, where was it determined that you didn't make the choice? And I'll also add that the whole predestination thing of he picks people from the start. What's the point of planting seeds in these people? Have you ever heard that that thing, planting a seed in someone's heart and then let God do the rest?
Yeah.
What's the point of planting seeds into that serial killer's heart? And I know that's an extreme serial killer. I'm just putting it out there. What's the point of planting into their heart if they're already predetermined to hell?
That's a great question that I don't have the answer for.
What's the point of
I suppose
preaching?
there isn't one.
Yeah, what's the point of preaching Bible to the world if there's people already predetermined to heaven? So, well, they got to have that light switch turned on. Well, they've already been predetermined before they were born that they're going to heaven. So why turn the switch on? They're already predetermined.
I don't know. I don't like that whole, like, the two, schools of thought that you talked to at the very beginning, that your church.
Oh, Calvinism and Arminianism.
Yes. I don't. Those to me don't make very much sense.
Well, Arminianism makes a little bit more sense. I understand each point of each one. Arminianism is the idea that we do all the work and then we find Christ. I don't wholeheartedly agree with that. I think there's a little bit of both. Other people are doing stuff. Christ is presenting himself out there through other people.
But do you believe, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I know we're kind of getting close to time, so I wanted to jump this in real quick. Did you believe in divine intervention, though?
If we seek it.
I see. That's where you and I would disagree. Maybe we can talk about this some other time. I don't think so. I think, like, for example, the Apostle Paul was the exact opposite of what you would think
You're right.
believer would be, and his intervention came when he was blindsided by it, in effect, and it just totally transformed his life. So, no, I think divine intervention happens to people that least expect it all the time, and they're basically conflicted, or rather confronted with something they denied their entire life, and then it just totally transforms their viewpoint.
Well, I say, let me rephrase that. I do sound kind of stupid because that's an excellent example of him he was choosing to kill him. So, okay. In my case, divine intervention, I sought it. I told you what happened with me. I won't go into it on the air, but I sought it. I sought after it. But I do think there's also cases out there where, Paul is a perfect example. Christ came to him and said, "Hello," and you had to press on, you had to go on, and changed his life. But I also know that he still had to make a choice whether he was going to follow him or not. I will say this, as someone who has had that experience, choosing against that, you'd have to be insane. That's all I can say. I mean, I say that because
the Lord speaks to you, and there's this angelic tone, and you just are like, "Nah, I'm good."
Jacob, I don't know if you've had the experience, and I'm not. There's no way of me bragging or boosting myself that I had this experience because I was awful. But the feeling that I got from this, I have not been able to replicate it at all. I don't think you can.
Sure.
So to choose against that, I think you'd be insane. But I'm sure there's.
Well, maybe you can, because free wills exist.
Yeah, but you could still do it. There's people that are presented with it all the time. Hey, you do this, this, and this. They follow Christ their whole life, and guess what? They fall away, which leads to the other thing. In Revelation, it will say people's names will be blotted out of the book of life. If there's no free will, then how do you fall away?
I don't know. It depends on when that was determined.
Well, if it's determined before time that you're going to heaven, you can't get blotted out of the book of
Yeah,
life.
yeah, we're going back down that rabbit hole. And again, I'm being quite facetious right now, but
See, I mean, it's I don't know. I
no,
think there's
I
free
think
will.
I think I think we could leave it there and spark hopefully some interesting conversation with the listeners on this one. I really hope that if you are listening to this and you have any thoughts at all, you would send them our way in the various ways that you can, because I would love to hear your thoughts and perspectives on this. And real quick, off topic, not to explain the joke, but anytime you hear an outburst and last week's introduction to the show, the joke around Brantley and I is Robert Tilton. So if you hear us just utter something ridiculous that doesn't seem to make sense, that's almost certainly where it came from. And our introduction last week had several clips that I'm sure you heard and were probably thinking, what was that? And how is it relevant to what they talked about? It wasn't. And it's not. It's just something that makes us laugh personally. You can laugh along or you can completely disregard it, but we think it's quite funny. So anyway.
And the reason these outbursts happen, people, is that it's so ingrained in our head. It's like triggers. We're like addicts. One thing
Yeah.
can trigger an outburst, and before you know it, we're like, "Hello." So we're cursed in that regard, but we
I
love the
suppose.
curse.
I suppose we are, but it does make me laugh a lot. So I had a lot of fun putting that together, and I know you said you enjoyed it quite a bit too. So,
Oh yeah,
but
it was fantastic.
as it relates to the topic again, just encourage you to send in those thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. And Brantley, I've got to say this was as thought provoking as I think it can be. I'm sure. I think people reach like a certain point where it's just too much abstract thinking, and they're just like, you know what, I don't really know about it, so I'm just gonna check out.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. So if you are curious about this, there's a lot of interesting articles and a lot of interesting conversations and other podcasts that people do that have a lot of these experts on. Like Dr. Jordan Peterson had a great take on this, and I probably will play some of those clips at the beginning of this episode. So definitely look into it. Check it out. Always, and I'm always a huge advocate of anyone who's curious about something, look into it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. Don't just take my word for it. Don't just take Brantley's word for it. Read the Bible, read whatever materials you like, and draw your own conclusion from things and really do some deep thinking. And I think you're going to be a more sure about who you are as a person if you can do that kind of thing. So that's what I would encourage you to do if you were at all moved by this conversation or curious at all about anything we talked about.
Yeah. And remember, I love you.
Brantley, do you have any other thoughts on this before we wrap things up here this week?
No, this is a great episode. Time flew by on this one. I'm actually shocked we're at time. I was like, man,
Yeah.
where did it go? Which was predetermined, that time was determined.
Yeah, it was predetermined that we were going to end this episode right on time.
Yeah, that's all I got, Jacob. I appreciate everybody listening, and we're excited to be back. I hope y'all love that intro. That's a fantastic intro that Jake the Snake himself made. So,
I appreciate the kind words, but be sure to tune in next week. I won't spoil the topic, but Brantley's been writing an episode I'm very excited for us to talk about. And again, like we mentioned last week, we have other episodes that we're writing right now that we think are going to be just as compelling as this one. So please be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or audio entertainment. We'd love for you to join us each and every week. If you're on YouTube, we are so glad to be back on that platform. And it's been a while since we posted, but we kicked off season 3. We got a good response. If you're on YouTube and you want to leave us a comment, a like, those two things are greatly appreciated. And if you like what we do here, maybe consider subscribing as well. But other than that, everyone, we are going to sign out here. Thank you again for listening. Thank you, Brantley, for joining me as always. And we will see you all next week. Peace.